Okay,
You ready to go?
sure. Why not?
All right. Three, two. Hi, Graham. How are you?
Brian, nice to see you. Good
Nice
to
to
be
see you
here.
too. I like your room. Is that your music room?
It's the room in my house where if any music happens, it's usually in here. Yes. So I
Eh,
suppose that makes it the music room. Yeah.
Very nice. I see that you have a ukulele up there.
I love my ukes. I've got
Yeah.
multiple ukes. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And I've been on a quest to find a good uke that's not made in China, and it's fucking hard.
Ah, you know
So,
what?
but anyway,
I've recently started playing ukulele too because as a music teacher, I carry it. It's so easy to carry
and kids
with
kids
you.
love the uke, and it's
Kids
pretty
love it.
easy.
It's
My, I
very
taught I taught my son chords on a uke when he was probably about 9 years old, and the good thing about that is that those chords are the basis of guitar chords. So
yeah.
that led him to the guitar, and so now he plays guitar and bass, and yeah, so it's a really good jump off.
There you go. Yeah. Very, very kid friendly, I'd say, you know.
But George Harrison loved him too.
There you go. Yep. So anyway, Graham, welcome. Thank you so much for meeting with us. And
Good to
as I
be here.
always do, I like to start out with this very broad question, like, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is that you do, how do you describe yourself, maybe a little of how you got to where you are, and then we'll take the conversation from that point.
Well, okay, sure, fair enough. Well, I got into nuclear biochemistry in my teens. No, not really. Uh,
But up,
so
bump.
if I met, if I, I meet every now and again, I meet someone and I have to make they ask what you do, and I have to make an assessment on the fly, like how old are they, and will they even know the people I've worked with?
Yeah.
Like if I say Joe Jackson to them, or Marshall Crenshaw, or you know, Freddie Johnston, or like, are they just going to look at me like they have no idea what I'm talking about? So I usually I often ask people like, how old are you? And if they say
That's
like
good.
I'm 40, anything older than 40, I go, well, I started out in the 70s. I'm a bass player. I'm a professional musician miraculously for my whole life. And I started out working with a guy called Joe Jackson from Britain. You may have heard of him. I would only say that if they're over 40. If
Yeah.
they're under 40, I would say, do your parents have any Joe Jackson albums? Have you?
That's
So that's basically it. Yeah, I'm a musician. I'm a bass player, and I've had a incredibly fortuitous career starting in my mid 20s, and it's somehow still got some legs. And I just turned 70. So
God
how about that?
bless. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I got no complaints about that.
How did you? So I know this is a simple question because I'm going to ask you how you got started in the business. Um, but I guess I'd also like to hear, did you ever think you would be in the music business, 10 years after you got in? Did you even know you were in the music business when you were just playing
That's a
with
great
bands and,
question.
so
No, I didn't know, because I didn't make a red cent from music for the first, I mean, probably the first 5 years after I started playing music. I didn't make any money from it at all. And there was no expectation of that. So I certainly, when I was 16, that's when I started playing guitar. And I really wanted a guitar. It was like, I gotta have a guitar.
yeah.
It was like I was missing something, and I knew what it was I was missing. And I told my parents, I want a guitar. And they said, well, we'll get you a guitar, but you've got to pass your exams.
Yeah.
So I passed my exams and I got the guitar. And then of course, my academic prowess, such as it was, went right down the toilet. So, but I, I just loved to play, to sit in my room and figure stuff out. Never took any lessons, but I just loved to listen to records and figure out the chords and the fingerings. And, it was just such a joy. Like, I can't imagine that I've experienced joy like that you know, like it's a highlight. Even now, when I
Yeah.
think back to that, it's a highlight of my life. So to think that I actually could make a living at that, oh my, that would have seemed just preposterously optimistic
Yeah.
at that point. But yeah, it took a long time. It really took a long time. It took, yeah. I mean, I was 26 when I quit my job and became quote unquote a professional musician. So it
Wow.
was about 10 years of really scratching around and making
Yeah.
virtually no money.
So guitar was your first instrument.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And so
Which,
how did,
which, which music educators would call a foundation instrument, I think.
yeah.
Like a piano or a guitar is always a good
Yeah.
kickoff point. But after about a year of playing acoustic guitar, I had a school friend. So I was still in high school, the equivalent of what you call high school. I grew up in the south of England. So my high school was actually called a grammar school.
Okay.
And I had a good friend in grammar school whose name was John Jackson, no relation to Joe Jackson, completely different guy. And John and I, you know, we it was a little club of kids at school who we would sit around and talk about our favorite music, you know, musicians and Beatles and Cream and Hendrix and all of that, you know. And one day he said, and I knew he played the piano, right? And he came to school one day and he said, I know this bloke. He's selling 2 guitars and one of them's a 6-string electric and the other's a bass. I'm going to buy the 6-string electric. And I wondered if you wanted to buy the bass. 15 quid each, you know, which was affordable. I mean, back then, you know, 15 pounds was probably the equivalent of like $100.
Yeah.
It was totally affordable. I mean, I had to get the money off of my parents, but
Yeah.
I knew it was doable. So that's how it happened. And as soon as he said, do you want to buy the bass? I don't know why he thought I might want to buy the bass, because I don't remember ever expressing to anyone that I wanted to play the bass.
Yeah.
But as soon as he said that, I was like, I felt like the whole rest of my life kind of rolled out in front of me from that moment, you know.
Yeah.
And it was like a little miracle or something, you know. So I bought the bass and I locked myself in my bedroom for months and didn't do any schoolwork. I just was just playing the bass and digging it, you know.
So did you have early guitar influences, and then as you switched to bass, I guess, did you also discover great bassists?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're all, you know, when we're young, we're all influenced by the things that we're listening to. And that's all I was listening to stuff like, you know, Cream and Hendrix, Deep Purple.
Yeah.
And I should have actually said the Beatles first and foremost.
Yes.
And that was, you know, I mean, still that I think that's a major influence on not just me as a musician, but on my taste in songwriting and song structure and recording, you know.
Yeah.
I still feel like I know it's kind of, maybe a lot of people are yawning right now because it's like, oh, Beatles, you know. I mean, a lot of people are over the Beatles, but I don't think I'll ever be over the Beatles.
Oh my goodness.
I think that you know, their influence has stood the test of time, to say the very least.
Absolutely.
So that's the kind of stuff that we were listening to anyway. And yeah, I had a little club of kids at my grammar school, and on break times they would let us use the school record player.
Oh, nice.
So we you know, we'd bring albums in, and they would actually let us play our favorite albums over the school sound system at lunchtimes.
That's a great idea.
So, yeah, so we'd play Cream and Hendrix and oh my God, all sorts of things. Like the original Fleetwood Mac, which was a blues band with Peter Green.
Yes.
Who was an amazing guitar player. Yeah, we play that kind of stuff, a lot of blues-based guitar stuff. And yeah, we kind of bonded over that. And those were the first, that was the first, you know, when you're young and you kind of meet your tribe, I felt like that's when I met my tribe. It was all around music.
Gosh, yeah.
And it was sort of like music was the magnet that sucked us all in. And the guys that were serious about it, you know, that's all we'd just talk about music all the time, you know.
You know, I happen to know that you're a father, and as a dad myself, I mean, I think you would agree that it's probably the single most important thing I hope for my kids, that they find that one thing, that one area that kind of drives them from, you know, from morning to night, you know,
right.
the kind of
And brings them joy, you know.
exactly, yeah,
And you know, it's
and their
funny
network
because,
and
yeah, it's funny because I every now and again I hear something that reminds me of that joy that music can bring to your life, and it's like another language that you just know it, and when
yeah,
you hear it, you recognize it. And I had the moment like that actually last year. I heard this musician called Jacob Collier, who's one of my favorites at the moment. He's a British kid. He's pretty young. He
I'm
may
gonna write
still
this
be in
down.
his late 20s, and he's a phenomenal musician. But anything that I've heard by him, there's so much, not just musicianship and creativity and musicality, but joy. There's so
Yeah,
much joy in what he does. And it just reminds me, like, yeah, that's why I love music from the
yeah,
beginning. When I, the first, one of another pivotal moment was when I heard the Beatles doing Love Me Do when I was 11 years old on the
yeah,
radio.
yeah.
And whatever I was doing, playing with toy soldiers or something, but I stopped and my ears pricked up. I was like, wow, I really like that. I want to hear more of that, you know?
Yeah,
So, and I was
that's
11, you know, so.
that's
Yeah.
great. And so how did you get into bands? Was it that crew of kids that you were with that you formed bands, you played dances and parties and all that stuff?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, those kids, you know, some of them were musicians or thought they were musicians. And, you know, there was a high school band, but I didn't find anybody really good. Actually, there was one kid who was a good guitar player, but for some reason, I was still playing guitar when I met him, and he taught me like the bar chord, you know. But we never were in a band together. And the kids I ended up forming a band with were pretty terrible actually. And I remember having that moment when I realized that I was like making way faster progress than these
Yeah,
guys, and like I didn't really want to play with these guys. Like if I was
yeah,
going to play with people, I wanted to play with better people than that. So it took a while, years really, to find people that I thought were up to the. I mean, that sounds egotistical, but you know, you need people that are going to push you. You don't
absolutely.
want to be the one that's like dragging them, you know.
Right.
So so it took a while. It took a while for that to happen.
And I'm just thinking of you as a bass player because when I was in high school, we could not find any bass players. You know, we couldn't get, you know, it was almost like, yeah, we we'd have to recruit somebody from another town or go to the biggest town to find a bass player. But you were the bass player. You could have gone
Yeah, I
anywhere.
could have cleaned up, right? I know. I remember there was I remember talking to somebody back then, and when I first started out, and I said, well, I really want to play the bass, and whoever it was, I think it was an old family friend who was in a like a beat group. That's what they used to call them back
Right.
then, a beat group. And he said, if you're a bass player, you'll always have a gig. I remember
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
said that to me. I was like, oh, that's good, you
Yeah.
know. And you know, I guess that proved pretty, you know, prescient actually.
Nice.
So
So continue with the timeline. So how do you get your first gig? What's your first band? You know,
oh well,
tell
the
us
first
about.
band. Well, all right. So I'll try and do a little synopsis here. But
Yeah.
the very very first band, I love to tell the story of my first band only because nobody ever believes what we called ourselves. Because I think I probably told you this years ago, but my very very first band. So this was two guys from my high school. We had a trio, and I was a bass player, and we actually had a guitar player. He was all right. He was okay, and our drummer was terrible, but he was a great guy. So
Yeah.
we used to just hang out and we would bash through Led Zeppelin tunes and Hendrix tunes and Cream tunes, and we'd have a great time. But we were fucking awful, and of course we couldn't get a gig
Yeah.
because for two reasons, or at least two reasons. One reason was there was really nowhere to play. You know, there was no, I mean, not that we knew of. And the other reason was that we were terrible. And then there was another reason, and that is that we decided to call ourselves Septic Bowels. You see, because we thought, well, I guess we were out to shock. We were out to shock, you know.
Yeah.
And I guess we shocked people to the point where they weren't interested in giving us a gig.
Yeah, I wonder what that brainstorming session was like. You're sitting around smoking cigarettes in someone's basement.
Oh my God, I know. I think about that sometimes. I'm sure a lot of beer was involved.
Yeah,
and I'm sure that, you know, somebody said it as a joke, and somebody else said, "Oh, that's brilliant."
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I remember my mother eventually took pity on us, and she said that basically my mother threw a party and invited her friends and family, and we had the party at our house.
And you played?
We played. Septic Bowels played the party, and she catered in fish and chips because it's Britain.
Yeah.
And at the very end of the evening, my mom, who used to love to sing, she got up and sang "Summertime," you know, George Gershwin.
Yeah.
And we backed her up. And I'm sure it was god awful, but it was the first gig we did, and it was like a triumph, you know.
Oh, that's nice.
Thank you, Mom.
What a supportive mom.
Thank
yeah.
You, Mom. Yeah. So anyway, so that was the first band, and there were a bunch of equally terribly named bands after that. The first band that I actually thought were good, it was a couple of years later. We had a band called Mustang, and I had a friend who was a pretty good drummer that I had met once I was now in the workforce, and we found a guitar player, a local guy, who was actually very good, and he could play Hendrix like very convincingly. And so we cut some kind of very basic demos, and we did a bunch of gigs, and I thought we were coming on, you know. We had some potential, and I always remember we entered a contest in Brighton. There was a music paper in Britain called The Melody Maker, and they held a contest every year for like the best unsigned band. So we entered this contest, and it was very sobering because we thought we were pretty good, but there were probably 6 other bands that were trying out for this contest, and they were really good. I mean, we thought they were really good, and we were just like, we were humbled, and you know, we realized we got some work to do, you know. So that didn't last too long anyway. There were some personality clashes, and after that I was in a cover band for a while. It was a 3-piece, and we decided that we were going to try and turn professional. So that was our goal. So we learned like 200 songs, and we learned some stupid jokes to tell in between the songs.
Nice.
And we signed with a local booking agency, and we actually got gigs, and we actually made money, and we bought a new van, and we bought a new PA, and yeah, like it was going really well. And we lasted about a year, maybe a year and a half. And the end of the band, because we actually were traveling around the country, and we were doing all right. And then we made some demos because we were writing some songs between us, you know, and we thought the demos were pretty good. So we played the demos to our booking agency, and they kind of like just completely shot us down. They said, "Lads, nobody wants to hear this. Just keep doing what you're doing. You'll be great." And I remember we left the office just like
devastated,
hanging our heads, just like, oh, you know. And we didn't last too much longer because we just didn't want to keep playing the same shitty clubs we'd been playing for a year. So
yeah.
And it was right after that I met Joe Jackson.
What were before we get to Joe, what were there any around this time that you're speaking of, were there any active bands that were, you know, maybe a little more successful than you guys? Like, what was going on? Like, what were the other bands that were maybe either your competition or the bands in England that were writing their songs, recording them and getting signed and stuff?
Well, in answer to that, you know, there were bands in our area. So we're from the Portsmouth area, which is central southern England, and probably the most famous band from that area was Manfred Mann, who had a whole ton of hits back in the 60s. So they were like, you know, if we could be like Manfred Mann, wow, that would be incredible. And then when I first started playing, you know, so we're probably talking in the late 60s. I was still at school, but there was a band from our hometown that actually got signed to a record deal. They were called Simon Dupree and the Big Sound. They were a rhythm and blues band, but they were very good. They were a really good rhythm and blues band. And they actually had a hit single in the UK charts called Kites, and which was not a rhythm and blues song. And but it was their big hit. And we were in awe of them because a couple of them lived in my hometown, which is called Gosport. And then so we were encouraged by that. We were like, yeah, people from our town actually, you know, can do this.
Yeah.
And then we heard that the drummer had left the band, and not only that, but he started a barbershop right across the street from my parents' house.
Wow.
So of course I went over there to get my hair cut because I wanted to talk to him, you know, like what happened, and I wanted to hear some good rock and roll stories from this guy. So he's cutting my hair, snip, 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 you know, and I'm saying, you know, wow, it must have been so exciting, you know. And he was already just
salty.
He was totally over it, you know. And I was telling him, well, you know, I just started playing bass and I really want to get into this. And he said, he was trying to talk me out of it, you know. He was like trying to tell me what a shit business it was, not to do it. You know? I didn't want to hear it. You know? I couldn't believe it. You know, this guy actually to me, he was famous, and he was trying to talk me out of it. So, but funnily enough, Simon Dupree and the Big Sound broke up a few years later, and three of them were brothers, and they lived in my hometown, 5 minutes from my house, and they started another band called Gentle Giant.
Oh wow!
And they were called the Shulman Brothers, and
Gentle
they were
Giant.
Brilliant musicians.
Yes,
I mean, like, you know, I think Gentle Giant became like a prog rock.
It's like one of the greatest,
like a cult,
prog rock bands ever. Progressive, you know.
And they were from my hometown.
2 weeks in Spain was their biggest
I knew,
song.
I knew you'd be familiar with them. Yeah, they were from my hometown.
Wow, what a great band.
Yeah, so I mean, there were encouraging reasons like that to think that we could get somewhere was not out of the question.
Yeah.
So, and that was right around the time I met Joe, and then, you know, then there was a little more ambition once I met Joe.
So I do want to talk about Joe. I think there's a lot we're going to cover. We're about at the 23-minute mark here.
You know.
So we're going to, is it okay if we cap it off for part 1 here?
Sure.
And then reconvene for part 2?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Sounds good.